"Go ahead," Daniel said into the microphone, his voice smooth with practice charm. "Everyone deserves a second chance, even if they failed the first time." The room responded exactly the way he expected: soft laughter, a few raised brows, glasses pausing midair beneath the golden chandelier light of the ballroom, and every eye turned toward her as if on cue, as if this moment had been rehearsed without her consent, as if humiliation could be scheduled between dinner and dessert. Emily Carter didn't move. She stood near the edge of the marble floor, one hand resting lightly on her son's shoulder, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, the kind of stillness that didn't belong in a room designed for performance. The silk of her dress caught the light just enough to remind them she had made an effort, though not the kind they understood, not the kind meant to impress them. Daniel continued speaking, adding just enough humor to make cruelty sound like honesty, the kind of man who had learned how to disguise judgment as wit, and the guests leaned in, complicit in their silence, comfortable in the narrative he was offering them. A single mother, left behind, still showing up where she no longer belonged. Emily could feel the weight of it, not as something new, but as something familiar, like a script she had already memorized long before tonight. Her son shifted slightly beside her, small fingers tightening around hers, and she gave the faintest squeeze back, not to reassure him, but to anchor herself. Because leaving now would be easy. That was the expectation. That was the role they had written for her: the quiet exit, the lowered gaze, the unfinished glass of water left behind as proof that she had once been here and didn't deserve to stay. But Emily didn't step back. She didn't look away. She didn't interrupt. Instead, her gaze lifted, not to Daniel, but past him, toward something only she seemed to understand in that moment, something that made her presence feel less like defiance and more like inevitability. There was a flicker, barely noticeable, in her eyes, not pain, not anger, but recognition, as if this exact scene had already played out somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere without witnesses, and tonight was simply the version the world was allowed to see. Daniel finished his sentence with a smile that invited applause, and a few polite claps followed, thin and scattered, dissolving quickly into the hum of conversation that pretended nothing unusual had happened. But the air had shifted, subtly, like the moment before a storm that no one believes is coming because the sky still looks clear. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling with a calm that didn't match the tension around her, and for the first time since she stepped into the room, she moved, just one step forward, deliberate, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. Because she wasn't here by accident. She wasn't here to be forgiven, or pitied, or even understood. She was here because she chose to be. And the difference between those two things, the version of her they thought they knew and the one standing in front of them now, was something no one in that room had noticed yet. Not even Daniel. The sound of polite conversation slowly returned, but it no longer flowed as naturally as before, as if something invisible had unsettled the rhythm of the room, and Emily could feel it in the way people avoided looking directly at her now, choosing instead to glance and then quickly look away, unsure whether they had just witnessed something insignificant or the beginning of something they did not yet understand, and for a brief moment, the memory of another room surfaced in her mind, smaller, quieter, filled not with crystal glasses and tailored suits, but with unopened bills spread across a worn kitchen table, the faint hum of an old refrigerator in the background, and the soft, uneven breathing of her son asleep in the next room. A time when silence felt heavier than any public humiliation, when there was no audience to impress and no one to defend her dignity except herself, and she remembered standing there barefoot on cold tile, reading the final message Daniel had left on his phone, not cruel in tone, not loud, just certain, just final, as if walking away from her had been a simple decision he no longer needed to explain. And she had not cried then either, not because it did not hurt, but because something inside her had already begun to shift, something quiet and unshakable that did not demand immediate answers or dramatic reactions. Something that simply observed and endured, the same stillness that now kept her rooted in place while the echoes of Daniel's voice faded into meaningless background noise. And back in the ballroom, her son looked up at her, searching her face for a signal, for a cue on how to feel, and Emily lowered her gaze just enough to meet his eyes, offering a calm that was not forced, but chosen, a reassurance that did not come from denial, but from certainty, because leaving would have been easy, leaving would have been expected. And expectations were the one thing she had stopped obeying a long time ago, and somewhere across the room, a man stood near the bar, unnoticed by most, his attention fixed not on Daniel or the crowd, but on her, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment to unfold, his expression composed, almost indifferent, yet there was a sharpness in his gaze that suggested he was not merely observing but recognizing, and Emily did not look at him directly, not yet. But she was aware of his presence in the same way one becomes aware of a shift in air before a door opens, subtle, precise, impossible to ignore once felt, and the orchestra resumed playing a soft instrumental piece, the kind meant to smooth over tension and restore elegance. But the illusion had already cracked, and Emily took another step forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, not loud enough to demand attention, but steady enough to claim space, and with each step, the version of her that had once stood in that small kitchen, uncertain and alone, seemed to fall further behind, replaced by something quieter, sharper, something that did not need validation from anyone in the room, least of all the man who believed he had already defined her story. And as she moved closer to the center of the ballroom, the distance between past and present narrowed into a single, controlled breath, because tonight was not about proving him wrong, it was about allowing him to continue believing he was right, just long enough for the truth to arrive on its own terms. There was a moment, barely a second long, when the room seemed to hold its breath without realizing it, as if something unspoken had begun to settle beneath the surface of polished smiles and rehearsed conversations. And Emily could feel it in the way the space around her no longer pushed her out but instead made room, subtle, reluctant, but undeniable, and Daniel noticed it too, though he could not yet name it, his confidence still intact but no longer effortless, like a performer who sensed the audience shifting but continued the act anyway, unwilling to break character, and he stepped down from the small stage with a glass in hand, moving through the crowd with the ease of someone who believed he owned every inch of the room, stopping just close enough to her to make his presence felt without appearing confrontational, his smile returning, softer now, almost amused, as if her decision to stay had become part of the entertainment he had not planned but was willing to enjoy, and he tilted his head slightly, lowering his voice just enough to create the illusion of privacy while ensuring those nearby could still hear fragments of it, the careful balance of control he had always mastered, and he said, "You always did have a way of making things uncomfortable, as if discomfort itself were her flaw, not his design," and Emily turned her head just enough to acknowledge him, her expression calm, not defensive, not inviting, simply present. And she did not answer, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood something he did not, that silence in the right moment could carry more weight than any carefully chosen words, and the absence of her response lingered longer than expected, stretching the space between them until it became noticeable, until even those pretending not to listen felt the tension settle in, and Daniel let out a small laugh, the kind meant to recover control, to reframe the moment before it slipped too far from his grasp, but it did not land the same way it had earlier, not as easily, not as cleanly, and across the room, the man near the bar had not moved, his attention still fixed, his posture unchanged, as if he had already seen enough to confirm something only he understood, and Emily shifted her weight slightly, her hand still resting on her son's shoulder, grounding herself in something real, something that existed beyond the performance unfolding around her, and for a brief second, her gaze flickered toward the man, not fully, just enough to acknowledge his presence, and in that quiet exchange, something passed between them without words, something intentional, something that had been set in motion long before tonight, and she looked back at Daniel, not with resentment, not with longing, but with a clarity that felt almost foreign to the version of her he remembered. As if she were no longer reacting to him but observing him, seeing him not as the man who had once defined her life, but as a part of it that no longer held authority, and the realization did not arrive to him all at once, but it began, small and unsettling, like a crack forming beneath something he had always assumed was solid, and for the first time that evening, he hesitated, just slightly, just enough to reveal that the balance he thought he controlled was beginning to shift. And Emily did not need to push it, did not need to prove it, because she was not here to win a moment. She was here to let it unfold, exactly as it was meant to, on her terms, in her time, and the room, without understanding why, began to lean toward her story instead of his. The music softened into something almost forgettable, a gentle piano melody meant to smooth over the edges of the evening, but Emily no longer heard it the way the others did, because her mind had already drifted somewhere quieter, somewhere far from the polished floors and curated laughter, back to mornings that began before sunrise when the world was still dark and honest, when she would tie her hair back in the small mirror of a narrow apartment bathroom, the lights slightly flickering. Overhead, her reflection not glamorous but steady, determined in a way that did not need witnesses, and she remembered the weight of a paper coffee cup warming her hands during early shifts at a corner cafe, the scent of roasted beans clinging to her clothes as she moved between tables, memorizing orders, forcing polite smiles for strangers who never looked long enough to see her, and later, after long hours on her feet. She would sit at a small wooden table no bigger than 3 feet across, her son asleep beside her on the couch, a soft blanket tucked around him, while her laptop screen glowed in the dim light, numbers and charts filling the space where uncertainty used to live, and she taught herself slowly, methodically, piece by piece, financial terms that once felt foreign becoming familiar, strategies replacing fear, discipline replacing doubt, and no one applauded those nights. No one watched her learn how to rebuild something invisible, something that did not show on the surface, but changed everything beneath it, and there were moments when exhaustion pressed in, when the silence felt heavier than any crowd, when she questioned whether any of it would matter, but she never stopped, not because she was certain of the outcome, but because stopping would have meant accepting the version of her that had been left behind, and she had already decided she would not stay there, and back in the ballroom. Her fingers rested lightly against the fabric of her dress, the same hands that had counted tips, typed late into the night, signed small agreements that slowly became larger ones, and the distance between those quiet nights and this polished room no longer felt like a gap, but a bridge she had already crossed, and Daniel, still standing near her, could not see any of that, could not imagine the version of her that existed beyond the one he had walked away from, because to him, time had frozen the moment he left, preserving her in a past that no longer existed, and that was his mistake, not hers. And across the room, the man near the bar finally shifted, setting his glass down with a quiet precision before stepping forward. Not rushing, not drawing attention, but moving with a confidence that did not need to announce itself, and Emily felt it before she saw it, the subtle change in the air, the same quiet signal that had been present since she walked in, now beginning to take form, and she did not turn immediately, did not acknowledge it outwardly, because she understood timing in a way she never had before, understood that not every truth needed to be revealed the moment it existed. Some truths were stronger when they arrived exactly when they were meant to, and as the distance between past effort and present moment narrowed into something tangible, Emily remained exactly where she was, not because she was unsure, but because she had already done the hardest part long before tonight, and everything that followed from here was no longer about becoming someone new, but allowing the world to finally see who she had already become. The distance between them closed without urgency, yet every step he took seemed to carry a quiet authority that did not need permission, and though most of the room had not yet noticed him, those who did instinctively shifted their posture, their conversation softening, their attention adjusting in subtle ways that revealed recognition before any formal introduction could, and Emily felt it as clearly as if the air itself had changed direction, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged. Yet something beneath it sharpened with quiet precision, because this was not a surprise, not to her, not anymore, and when Alexander Hayes stopped just a few feet away, he did not immediately speak. Did not interrupt the fragile balance that had formed between Emily and Daniel, but instead allowed a brief silence to settle, the kind that felt intentional rather than empty, and Daniel turned slightly, his expression polite but guarded. The instinctive reaction of a man who sensed influence, without yet understanding its source, and he offered a measured nod, the kind reserved for strangers who might matter, and Alexander returned it with a calm that was neither submissive nor confrontational, simply certain, and for a moment. The three of them stood within the same space, yet not on equal ground, not anymore, and Emily finally turned her gaze fully toward Alexander, not with surprise, not with hesitation, but with a familiarity so subtle it could easily be mistaken for composure. Though beneath it existed something far more deliberate, something built over time rather than discovered by chance, and Alexander's eyes met hers with the same quiet recognition, a shared understanding that did not need explanation, and when he spoke, his voice was even, low, and precise, carrying just enough weight to draw attention without demanding it, and he said, "I was wondering how long you would let this continue," not as a question, but as an observation, and Emily allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch her lips, not for the room, not for Daniel, but for the moment itself, because the timing had finally aligned, and Daniel glanced between them, the first real flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Subtle but unmistakable, as if a conversation had begun without him, and he was only now realizing he had never been part of it, and the nearby guests leaned in slightly, their curiosity sharpening into focus, sensing that something beyond social politeness was unfolding, something they had not been invited to but could not ignore, and Emily shifted her weight just enough to stand beside Alexander rather than apart from him, a movement so small it could be dismissed as coincidence, yet intentional enough to redraw the boundaries of the space they occupied, and she did not introduce him, did not explain, because she understood that explanation would only reduce what did not need to be simplified. And Alexander did not rush to define himself either, his presence alone beginning to alter the tone of the room in ways Daniel could not control, and for the first time that evening, the narrative Daniel had constructed began to loosen at the edges, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through something far quieter and far more dangerous, the introduction of a truth he had not anticipated, and Emily remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, composed, still, and entirely certain, because she had not stayed to endure the moment. She had stayed because she knew it would change. The silence that followed his words did not feel empty. It felt precise, like a line drawn carefully across a surface no one else realized had been marked, and Daniel let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though it lacked the ease he had carried earlier, and he straightened slightly, adjusting the cuff of his jacket in a small, controlled motion, as if restoring order through habit, and he said, "I am sorry. I do not believe we have met," directing the words toward Alexander with a polite tone that masked the growing tension beneath it, and Alexander regarded him for a moment, not dismissive, not impressed, simply present, and there was no rush in his response, no need to prove or establish anything, because his position did not rely on immediate recognition, and when he finally spoke, it was with the same calm clarity that had already begun to shift the room. "That depends on what you think this evening is about," and the ambiguity of the answer lingered, creating a pause that did not resolve itself, and Daniel's smile tightened just slightly, the edges of it no longer effortless, and around them, the nearby guests had grown noticeably quieter, their attention no longer pretending to be elsewhere, because something had changed in the dynamic they had so comfortably accepted moments before, and Emily remained still, her presence no longer defined by what had been said about her, but by what had not yet been revealed, and she could feel the weight of the moment settling into place, not as pressure, but as alignment, because everything that had led here had been built in silence. in patience, in choices that had never required validation, and now, those choices were beginning to surface without her needing to announce them, and across the ballroom, a member of the event staff approached the small stage again, adjusting the microphone, preparing for the next segment of the evening, and the subtle shift in lighting followed, the overhead chandeliers dimming just slightly as a spotlight formed near the center, signaling a transition that had been planned long before any of this tension existed. Yet, somehow now felt entirely connected to it, and Alexander glanced briefly toward the stage, then back to Emily, a silent confirmation passing between them, one that did not require words because the timing had already been agreed upon elsewhere, beyond the awareness of anyone in this room, and Daniel noticed the exchange, the quiet coordination he could not interpret, and for the first time, his gaze moved away from Emily not in dismissal, but in uncertainty, trying to place the pieces he had not known existed, and the announcer's voice returned, warm and professional, cutting gently through the thickening atmosphere as it invited attention back to the stage, mentioning a special acknowledgement, a recognition of contributions that had shaped more than just the event itself, and the phrasing was careful, elevated, carrying a weight that suggested significance without revealing specifics, and Emily's son looked up at her again, sensing the shift even without understanding it, and she rested her hand gently against his shoulder, grounding him the same way she had grounded herself through every quiet step that had brought her here, and she did not move forward yet, did not respond to the pull of the spotlight because she understood something that no one else in the room fully grasped, that the moment of revelation was not something to chase, it was something to allow, and as the light settled, as the room turned its focus toward what it believed would be another predictable part of the evening, Emily remained exactly where she was, composed, unhurried, and entirely certain. Because the story that was about to unfold no longer belonged to the man who had tried to define it, it belonged to the woman who had chosen to stay. The spotlight settled at the center of the ballroom, soft but commanding, and one by one the conversations faded into a quiet expectancy, the kind that only forms when people sense importance without fully understanding it. And the announcer's voice carried across the room with polished ease, thanking sponsors, acknowledging familiar names, building a rhythm that felt routine yet carried an undercurrent of anticipation, and Daniel shifted his stance slightly, his attention pulled toward the stage, his earlier confidence returning in fragments as he assumed the evening was returning to his control, to his narrative, and he glanced briefly at Emily, expecting her to remain on the outside of whatever recognition was about to unfold, still the same woman he believed he had already defined. But Emily did not follow his gaze to the stage immediately. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if the moment unfolding ahead was not something she needed to chase, and beside her, Alexander stood with the same composed stillness, his attention calm, not expectant, but certain, and when the announcer paused, allowing the silence to settle just long enough to draw every eye forward, the next words landed with a weight that subtly shifted the room, introducing a contribution that had quietly reshaped the foundation of the organization behind the event. A strategic investment that had not only stabilized its future but elevated its reach far beyond what had been expected, and a few guests exchanged glances, curiosity sharpening into focus, because this was not a name they had anticipated hearing tonight, and Daniel's expression tightened slightly, not yet alarmed, but attentive, trying to place himself within the context of what was being described, and then the announcer continued, mentioning that the individual behind this transformation had chosen to remain unrecognized until this moment, preferring impact over attention, a detail that drew a different kind of silence, one that carried respect rather than politeness. And Emily's son looked up at her again, sensing the shift in the room even without understanding it, and she rested her hand gently against his shoulder, grounding him with the same quiet certainty that had guided her through every unseen step, and then, without any abrupt movement, without any need for dramatic emphasis, Emily took a single step forward, just enough for the edge of the spotlight to reach her, and it was not the kind of entrance that demanded attention, but the kind that redirected it, naturally, inevitably. As if the room had been waiting without realizing it, and Daniel noticed it a second too late, his gaze snapping back to her, confusion breaking through the surface of his composure, because this was not where she was supposed to be. Not how this was supposed to unfold, and the announcer's voice softened slightly, the tone shifting from formal to deliberate as the final introduction began to take shape, and the space between expectation and reality narrowed into a single moment. Suspended and precise, and Emily did not rush it, did not speak, did not explain, because she understood that the most powerful truths did not need to be announced loudly. They needed only to be seen at the exact moment they could no longer be denied, and as the room held its breath without knowing why, the story Daniel had built began to unravel, not through confrontation, not through resistance, but through something far quieter, far more undeniable. The simple presence of a woman who had already become more than he had ever imagined. The announcer's voice did not rise, did not dramatize the moment, and that was what made it land with such quiet force as the name finally left his lips, Emily Carter, spoken with clarity and respect that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway. And for a fraction of a second, the room did not react, as if it needed time to reconcile the woman standing at the edge of the spotlight with the identity that had just been revealed, and then the shift began, subtle at first, a ripple of recognition passing from one guest to another, the kind that changes posture before it changes expression, and Emily stepped fully into the light, not hurried, not hesitant. Her movements measured with the same calm certainty that had carried her through every unseen moment that led here, and beside her, Alexander remained just outside the center, not stepping forward, not taking focus, because he did not need to. And that absence of movement said more than any introduction could, and the announcer continued, detailing the contribution in careful, elevated terms, speaking of strategic foresight, of decisive investment, of leadership that had chosen impact over recognition. And each word seemed to redraw the image the room had held of her only minutes before, replacing assumption with reality in a way that no argument could have achieved. And Daniel stood still, the glass in his hand forgotten. His expression no longer composed but searching, as if the pieces in front of him refused to fit into the version of the story he had built, and he looked at her differently now, not with familiarity, not with dismissal, but with the first real trace of uncertainty, because this was not the woman he had left behind, not the woman he had spoken about so easily, and Emily did not look at him immediately, did not acknowledge the shift in his expression, because this moment was not about correcting him. It was about allowing him to see without being told, and the applause began, not loud at first, but steady, growing not from obligation but from recognition, and it filled the space with a different kind of energy. One that no longer revolved around him, and Emily's son watched from just beyond the light, his small face lifted with quiet pride, understanding more than he could put into words, and she glanced back at him briefly, her expression softening for just a second before returning to the composed stillness that defined her presence, and then her gaze moved forward again, not searching, not seeking approval, simply present in the reality she had built without needing anyone's permission. And Daniel took a step forward without fully realizing it, as if drawn by something he could not control, but he stopped just short of the light, the invisible line between what he had been and what he no longer was now clearly defined. And Alexander finally moved, not toward the center, but toward Emily's side, a quiet alignment that did not need explanation, and when the announcer concluded, the words did not elevate her beyond reach. They simply placed her where she had already been all along, and the room understood it now. Not because she had declared it, but because she had allowed it to be seen, and in that moment, without confrontation, without a single raised voice, everything had changed. The applause lingered longer than expected, not overwhelming, not exaggerated, but steady in a way that carried recognition rather than performance, and Emily stood in the center of it without absorbing it, without letting it define her. because she understood something the room was only beginning to realize, that this moment was not her transformation, it was simply the first time they were seeing it, and as the sound gradually softened into a respectful quiet, she took a single step back, not retreating, but releasing the spotlight as naturally as she had entered it, and the shift was immediate, the attention following her not because she demanded it, but because it no longer knew where else to go, and Daniel remained where he stood, just outside the light. His posture, no longer confident, no longer certain, the distance between them no longer physical but something far more permanent, something that could not be crossed by words or explanations, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might speak, as though he might try to recover what had quietly slipped away, but nothing came, because there was nothing left to claim, nothing left to correct, and Emily turned toward him at last, not slowly, not dramatically, just enough to meet his gaze, and in that brief exchange, everything that had once existed between them felt smaller, quieter, almost distant, and she did not look at him with anger, did not offer satisfaction, did not even acknowledge the past he had tried to hold her in, because she no longer needed to, and the absence of reaction carried more weight than any confrontation ever could, and then, in a voice that was calm, steady, and entirely her own, she said, "You did not leave me behind. You just stopped walking where I was going." And the words did not echo, did not demand response. They simply settled into the space between them with a finality that required no explanation, and Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition of something he could not change. And that was enough. More than enough, and Emily turned away without waiting, without lingering, her hand reaching gently for her son's, and together they stepped away from the center of the room, not hurried, not hesitant, moving with the quiet certainty of people who no longer needed to prove where they belonged, and Alexander fell into step beside them, not leading, not following, but aligned in a way that did not need to be explained, and the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened as they approached, the cool night air slipping in just enough to break the warmth of the room behind them, and Emily did not look back, not once, because there was nothing behind her that required a second glance. And as they stepped out into the quiet beyond the lights and polished floors, the noise of the evening faded into something distant and irrelevant, and for the first time that night, there was no audience, no expectations, no narrative left to challenge or correct, only the steady rhythm of her own steps, the quiet presence of her son at her side, and the unspoken understanding that everything she had endured had not been wasted, it had been transformed, and she had not stayed to be humiliated. She had stayed because she already knew she would not leave the same.